So typically we try to deep dive and base anything that we say back up by data, because that is what we really believe is important. Because again, we might have opinions, but at the end, the data talk, and then what to try to do is to read the data and try to understand what data are trying to tell us. And so we are running this kind of analysis, and today we are launching a new report called Scaleup Spain. I have to thank you, the long-standing partnership with Crunchbase, and particularly for this kind of report, the long-standing partnership with ACCIONA, that decided to support this deep dive into the Spanish ecosystem since probably talk about 3, 4, 5, 6 years, I can't even 4. And so again, it's a sort of it's becoming a routine to deep dive the data together with ACCIONA to understand how the Spanish ecosystem is evolving. Because again, it's not standing, it's evolving. And so, just to give you some data, and I think talking about Spain, there is let's say, a sort of classico that's not just been played on the soccer fields, but is a classical that also be played on the technology field. And so the first question to answer, and that probably is also the answer that we're trying to give when people say, why you open up an innovation center in Barcelona and not in Madrid? That's quite a good question. And again, backing of data, if you look at the data, you see that Barcelona is presenting, as of today, numbers that are higher than Madrid. And you can see we're talking about 3 or 6 scale-ups. For us, scale-ups are startups that raise at least $1 million since inception. While Madrid have 2, 3, 4. Again, the gap is not that big, but there is substantial. And the gap is even wider if you look at the capital raised. These 3 or 6 scale-ups in Barcelona were being able to raise 6.7 billion cumulatively since inception, while the counterparts from Madrid raised just 5.1 billion. So talking about let's say 94% of the scale out of Spain are in these 2 cities. And in terms of capital deployed, 80% of scale-ups in these 2 ecosystems. In terms of capital, the percentage is even higher. We're talking about 89% of the capital raised in these 2 cities. Again, we have to say that Barcelona always stayed a bit ahead of Madrid. This is you see the annual evolution in terms of the darker line. This is the number of scale-ups that has been adding year over year, and you can see that Barcelona took a certain substantial advance around between 2014 and 2017, has been remaining ahead of the curve since then. There is something interesting is happening in 2021. You saw that the gap has substantially been reduced. You can see that the number of scale-ups added last year is pretty similar in the 2 ecosystems. And if you look at the capital, that most of the time money tells you a lot of things, you can see that, again, while in the prior years the capital raised by Barcelona, Catalonian scale-ups has been definitely higher. We're talking about almost 300, 400K higher than the Spanish Madridian counterparts. You see last year, for the first time historically, the scale-ups from Madrid were able to raise more capital than the scale-up from Barcelona. I have to say that 2021 has been a record year for both cities, above crossing the 2 billion bar. And again, when you're looking at the capital number, we need to see there are not some outliers, and that we try to identify what has been the large round that a certain way move up the numbers. You see, Job and Talent has been definitely one of them. Glovo, a final raise before the acquisition, has been another one. There are some other significant, like Idealistas, $500 million, and other interesting situation. But it's telling that, number one is both Barcelona and Madrid now are, let's say, important, relevant hotspots for innovation in Spain, and not just only in Spain. And then the gap between the 2 cities is definitely closing up. Next immediate question is, okay, fine, but Barcelona and Madrid are playing their own classical, but are they relevant at the international level? Yes or no? And this is what we call the Tech Scale-Up City Hub Index that we produce annually, and we keep it updated. And you can see that Barcelona is ranked 5 in Europe, while Madrid ranks 10th. And you see that the gap with the top 4 cities, specifically with the top one, that is London, is impossible to be breached. Again, we're talking about different numbers altogether. So in London, we have about 2,500 scale-ups, raising cumulative about 80 billion. Barcelona, as mentioned, is 306, raising 5.7 billion. So London is definitely the Premier League, is a different story. And then also Paris and Berlin are definitely taking the lead, not comparable to London, but still relevant. We're talking about 1,300 scale-ups for Paris, 33 billion, 34 billion raised. Germany, lower number of scale-ups, but definitely larger capital raised. Talking about 35 billion capital raised and 676 scale-ups. Stockholm is in between, and then Barcelona is leading the way of other, let's say, tier 2 European hotspots. We see Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Helsinki, Munich, Madrid, Dublin, and Milan, and Zurich. This is the cities that are moving between 200, 300 scale-ups each. So that's just to give you the sense of how these cities are positioned at the international level. And then you can see one other interesting data point that comes out of this analysis is that one thing that is pretty interesting when you look at the new economy, the economy of innovation in Europe, and not just in Europe. There is a very, very clear trend that tells us that the economy of innovation tends to concentrate in one city per country, typical the capital city. Just to give you an example of the 2 cities at the top of the ranking, London is concentrating about 75% of the scale-ups of all the UK. Paris, similar level, 70%. While London, if you look at the GDP that is produced in London, is producing something between the 20-25% of the GDP. Paris, the 20%. And they are concentrated about 20% of the population of the country. So something that comes out from analyzing this simple data is that the new economies is dramatically and brutally more concentrated than the old economy. If you look at Germany, I don't know how they did it, but probably because they are German, but the GDP of Germany is equally distributed in the 10 main cities. But the economy of innovation, the new economies, is concentrated in Berlin and a bit in Munich. Again, this trend is something that we need to consider because personally, I don't believe it is something that is neither desirable nor sustainable. We have also to factor, analyzing this data, what has happened in the past few years, because COVID in a certain way put a stop to this phenomenon of aggregation, but the trend is there and the data are supporting something like this. And so the question, and the interesting case of Spain in the international perspective is that, number one, Spain is probably the only country in Europe that are 2 hotspots of almost the same comparable size. And the question is, having 2 hotspots of the same comparable size is something that is producing more innovation, or in a certain way is something that is slowing down the country as a whole? Can a country afford to keep 2 different hotspots, or having just concentrated everyone is definitely more efficient? If you look at Germany, France, and UK, probably the answer is the other way, but Spain might be an interesting model also looking forward. And secondly is that, as mentioned, typically the new economy's concentration in the capital city. This is not the case for Spain, where Barcelona is by now taking the lead. So just have some food for thoughts. I don't have the answer, unfortunately, but just for giving you some food for thoughts here. Oops. This is the same data that are for weighted considering the GDP and what we call the investing ratio, putting the capital raise compared to the GDP and putting the number of scale compared to the population of the country, of the ecosystem in this situation, just to putting everything in a perspective. And you can see that typically the Nordic countries are way more performing in terms of ability to produce innovation than the southern country, and then Eastern Europe is still on the way. But again, just a different way to analyzing the data also for comparing apple with apples and oranges with oranges. There is some life beyond Barcelona, Madrid. The answer is yes. Valencia is the most obvious answer. It's becoming an interesting hub. Still not to be compared with the two ones, but it's growing healthily. 45 scale-ups, half a billion raised. Then we have Bilbao, we have Malaga and Seville that are separate, but most of the time they are almost considered as a single ecosystem, and some other cities are emerging. So something to be monitored in the next incoming years, which other hotspots are joining the list of the two top ones. Just to putting everything in comparison, because sometimes when we look at an ecosystem, we try to forget what is around. Again, Spain is not exactly the art of innovation in Europe. 69.3 scale-ups. For the first time with Glovo, they have the first super scaler, 1 billion of capital raised. The second line are what we call super scaler, 100 million capital raised. You see that the numbers are way better than Italy, but still there is a strong, big gap with the UK, France and Germany, and also Sweden. And again, Europe is not the art of innovation of the world, because the art of innovation of the world is unfortunately elsewhere. You can find the number of Silicon Valley over here, but if you look at Silicon Valley, we're talking about 7,500 scale-ups that are substantially the same number that 45 countries in Europe are producing. So Spain is not the innovation art of Europe, and Europe is not the innovation art of the world. So you can do your math. Finally, again, Spain is growing. For the first time has been crossed in 2021 the 5 billion bar in terms of capital raised. Cumulatively, we are beyond 100 scale-ups per year. And so there is an healthy ecosystem, it's growing, finally all the investment has finally to pay off, but it's not just Spain that is growing, it's Europe that is growing. 2021 has been a record year for Europe. We raised cumulative almost 82 billion, and we produced 1,600 of new scale-ups. And Spain is growing, but is not enough. Because typically the 5 billion that has been a record year for Spain in 2021, UK is 8x. Germany is, in terms of capital raise, is more than 4x, and Spain and France is 3x. Again, talking about Italy, since we have a pretty large contingent of Italian companies over here, Italy is even worse, because we are talking about less than 1/4 of the Spanish numbers. So, just to conclude, the open innovation is a continuous evolution, and that is important. Spain is making good progress. Barcelona and Madrid is an healthy competition that might help or might not the Spanish ecosystem to move forward, but still the huge with the rest of Europe is big, and the gap with the rest of Europe is big, and the gap of Europe with the rest of the world is even larger. And so I think the only answer is to continue to invest, to continue to work on innovation to produce results, because at the end it's the only thing that matters. Thank you.